Let us not stand on ceremony, Mr. Scrub. Perhaps you're wondering why someone would advertise Alpha Draft before throwing to a video about esports. It doesn't matter what I talk about. What matters is my plan. No one cared who I was until I put on the coat. Theatricality and deception are powerful agents to the uninitiated. But we are initiated, aren't we, Alpha Draftlets? Members of the League of Skrilla! You enter contests like a young man, with nothing held back. Admirable, but mistaken. Oh, you think fantasy LOL at LoL Esports is your ally. But you merely adopted the fantasy. I was reborn in it, molded by it. I didn't see Skrilla until I was already a man. By then it was nothing to me but sublime. Fantasy betrays you because it belongs to me. You don't fear losing your money. You welcome it. Your punishment must be more severe.
When League of Legends came along, it shook up the industry of gaming, the esports industry, even the team esports organizational industry, and on all levels, this game shook up the scene. So as a game, when it first arrived, as a MOBA and arts, whatever you want to call the genre, this is a game where that genre already existed. Dota already existed. Dota was this custom map for Warcraft 3, which had obviously been a very successful game in terms of number of games sold, because it was a single-player game, and that's actually the main reason a lot of these games back then used to be sold. The esports side, the multiplayer side, was just a side thing, an add-on thing that wasn't considered that big. People still mainly bought the game to play for the single-player mode. But Warcraft 3 had been one of the bigger European esports up until about sort of like 2009, when it started to die out quite a lot, and it's mainly just been China carrying it. Now, what's funny is if you watched esports, because Warcraft 3 was the main esport to have from this side of that game, Dota wasn't a very big esport. It was very small in the West, and it had Asian tournaments, but it wasn't like all over the big news sites. People weren't covering it very extensively. Because of this, most people just looked at what happened in Warcraft 3 and assumed as a result that success in China of Warcraft 3 was the reason why it had such huge numbers. Because what's funny is Warcraft 3 was very successful as a game in itself in China right towards the very end, 2009, 2010, etc., where a lot of the best players came from China, and they still had huge tournaments there, which a lot of the Westerners would go to, the best ones. But I remember seeing this stat where there'd been like so many million games of Warcraft 3 played in like a year, like, 2009, 2010 or something. But then when someone actually looked into it more, what they found was, yeah, there'd been millions of games played, but like the majority of those games were Dota. It was all people just playing Warcraft 3, but to play the custom map, to play Dota actually, not to play Warcraft 3 at all. So actually showed how the industry was kind of skewed. But the reason why you have to understand the reason why I put it like that is because, like I say, Dota wasn't relevant as an esport game, the first Dota. I mean, Blizzard really missed out when you consider that they essentially didn't monetize Dota whatsoever. It was just a game that someone made as a mod that was being played through their other game that you had to have owned. So great, you have to have Warcraft 3, but they didn't understand that Dota could be a game in its own right, that you could make they could make their own sequel. They could make their own sequel in a better engine. They could monetize that entirely, and it could get to where Dota 2 is now, which obviously is not owned by Blizzard. It's owned by Valve. And so the funny thing is, unlike Valve themselves with Counter-Strike, where they had Half-Life, which everyone bought, and then because if you'd bought Half-Life, because it's a fantastic single-player game, then you could then get the free mod of Counter-Strike, and then when they saw it become popular, within like a year or so, they'd gotten on board, they'd got the developers in, and they made it its own standalone game, which they then sold at retail and made a lot of money from. In this world, no one expected these types of games like Dota to be monetizable and to be big games in their own right. And at the time, developers weren't looking at esports titles. Like I say, they were looking still for the single player game that has a multiplayer aspect to it. And so you had League of Legends, HON come around, and early on, it wasn't certain which one was going to succeed. But obviously, League of Legends won out. HON kind of missed a trick because they went free to play too late, as far as I know. That's what I seem to remember, because at the time, before Dota 2, most of the people who were the Dota 1 pros, the really good players, and the people who went on to be Dota 2 pros, they were actually playing HON, and they were like, this is the better game, it's more mechanically intensive, we prefer this one, it's closer to Dota. League of Legends was considered more the casual one. And so then, even as a game, as it started to grow, no one really expected it as an esports game. It it would take off. Because in theory, in terms of genre, it wasn't even the best example. And esports in the past was always about showing excellence, getting the best game, getting the game that the pros want to play, and therefore you're going to get an excellent scene from. So as a game, even the success of it just as a general game was actually incredible in and of itself, because obviously it got very big in terms of player base. It sold for a lot of money in terms of the company, Riot selling out to Tencent, and then it made its entry as an esports game. Now you have to realize, as an esports game, people don't know this because they look at like the seasons, like they see, oh, season 1 was 2011. Oh, before that there was that World Cyber Games at CLG won. And oh, we all know, CLG existed back then. Then TSM came along. There was Curse and Epic Gamer. What they don't realize is most of that shit is actually before League of Legends was relevant as an esports game. I mean, up until as a game, it had already started to grow really big. Like by about 2011, it was pretty big already, just as a general game and multiplayer game. But 2010, it was irrelevant as an esports game. That tournament, the World Cyber Games that everyone references, that CLG one with Kobe in the lineup, yeah, that was a 4-team invitational tournament where some of the teams there, if you go and look at them, I mean, these teams are an absolute joke. So that wasn't some big tournament. And that was at the World Cyber Games. Yeah, it was a small little exhibition tournament. I was at that World Cyber Games. It was a tiny little tournament held off on one stage that had like a meager crowd, and no one really thought anything of it. And no one from the rest of the tournament knew what League of Legends was, aside from just this game that a lot of people didn't play. They didn't know about the esports side. There was no esports side, essentially. That's why when you talk about those early CLG lineups, the problem is, the reason why we can't count them as great lineups is, aside from that World Cyber Games, they're just playing online cups. I mean, right up until 2011, you have some of the best teams in the world playing Go for LOLs and tournaments like that. The whole point of a Go for LOL is it's supposed to be a tiny little weekly tournament with like a small prize purse, like $100 or whatever for first place. It's not supposed to be an esports competition. So if your whole career is winning those, at that point, you're not relevant in an esports game, unfortunately. That means you're more like a casual or a lower tier esports game. Because the player base gets bigger, here's what's interesting. What happens is, League's one of the first games, purely from player base, to make a transition in esports, but not directly. Not as in they see the player base, or look at all the esports tournament organizers and go, right, we've got to get in on this. No, they're holding the Go for Laws, etc. But that's where something changes. Because by about 2011, now the player base is pretty big. Now we're starting to see esports tournaments happen, where we have, obviously, the Season 1 Championship Riot does themselves, but that was just a side tournament at DreamHack. So what they do is they just they get buy their own slot at DreamHack, where you have many games, Quake, StarCraft, Counter-Strike, you have all these different games. They buy their slot there, and at the tournament, they put on a little tournament. It wasn't very big. It wasn't even one of the biggest at the whole tournament at the time. The final wasn't held in the same kind of illustrious scenario you saw the Counter-Strike finals held in, etc. Those were a bigger deal, but it's starting to get a foothold. And one of the key things they did, and why they started to get a circuit, is that Riot actually would invest money themselves for the prize pool. Other developers didn't do that. Like, even if it was a game like Counter-Strike that was very popular, Valve didn't even care about Counter-Strike. They didn't look at that whatsoever. They didn't do anything with Counter-Strike or provide not a single cent was coming from them. Instead, the tournament organizer had to realize that a game like Counter-Strike had to gauge is a game that's going to get viewers, it's got the good teams to play in it, already has the backing of the organization to send their teams, and then they go out and they get a sponsor, and they get the sponsorship money they need to put on the tournament and get the viewers, and all that cycle that had to all come from the tournament developer, actually, the organizer. But because Riot's willing to pay and they're willing to invest, now it gets its own little circuit. So by 2011, we've already got a circuit. Like, there's IEM events. They're in China, they're in Europe, they're in North America. There's MLGs. In fact, IEMs, there was this one period of time where they had like 3 IEMs in like the span of about 6 weeks or something crazy that were in like all these different regions of the world. They had MLG was doing their own events there. They had like one towards the end of 2011. We had IPL. IPL came along. They started to do events in... Because I think IPL 3, if I'm correct, was the first... I think that was the first one they had in League of Legends. They came along and started doing League of Legends. But it was Season 2, as in 2012, where League of Legends exploded as an esports game. This is when it was getting right up there with games like Counter-Strike, etc., and StarCraft 2, and it was actually exceeding it over the year. This is when we had a full circuit. They had IEMs, which also include the IEM World Championship, because that circuit had begun the year before. We had MLGs that were all big in the North American region, had a number of many good European teams go there. You had IPL, which obviously culminated in IPL 5, which was fantastic, but had events over the year as well, like the Showdown, etc. We had OGN, obviously in Korea. We got Champions began up there, OGN Champion seasons, spring, summer, going into winter. We had the Chinese tournament circuit. At the time, they didn't have LPL, but they had a whole bunch of land circuits already in 2012. Like, they had the TGA Grand Prix and all that stuff. They had loads of small tournaments. They had WEM come along, World Esports Masters, which had been more popularly known for its time in Counter-Strike and Warcraft 3, actually, which was a Korean guy running this tournament that took place in Hangzhou, China. Now, initially, it did get its foothold because of Riot paying for the prize pool, basically. Because actually, initially, stuff like IEM, etc., would not have taken on a game like League of Legends. Like, they wouldn't have known initially how many viewers it would get. And at the time, in terms of just the esports scene, other games were more popular, as in considered real esports. In fact, the industry in many ways was quite biased against League of Legends. Because at the time, streaming was not as big in 2011 and 2010. So that was less of a factor. You weren't going to get loads of views there. People still got views from like in-game client stuff, or then they were just doing the ESL TV type stuff if it was IEMs. So the industry naturally thought of itself as, we do games like Counter-Strike. We do games like StarCraft 2. We do games like Quake. These are all considered more skill, more strategical. These are true esports games. League of Legends was more in the position of being like this popular game that has a little bit of an esports side, and we'll think about it, but it's not going to be our premier game. And at the moment, we have no reason to think it will be. So actually, League of Legends at the time was more in the position of like, when it first came along, Hearthstone. Or years before, we're talking like 2009, 2008, World of Warcraft actually had a 3v3 competitive mode. And the reason I use those two reference points is because Hearthstone obviously has forced its way in because of the viewers. I mean, also because it's a game made by Blizzard, so it's an esports company. But it's mainly because it just has such good viewers that people will put on tournaments for it. World of Warcraft, as far as I know, came more from the dev side. This is where the devs actually were willing to put money into it, because World of Warcraft, the general MMO, is so huge and had so much money that this was a way to have some esports like extrusion for the game, and they were willing to put up some of the money to make this a viable esport, but otherwise it wouldn't have been put in there. And also it had very good viewing figures if they're believable, actually. Now, that's how, as a game, it changed the industry and shook it up. This is how, as an esports game, it changed the industry and shook it up. Now we've got to look at the organizations, as in the teams that put out a lineup to go and play League of Legends, or use the same money to go and get a better Counter-Strike team, or have a Quake Live player, or a Warcraft 3 player, or a StarCraft 2 player. So when it comes to these organizations, on both continents, Europe and North America, you can already see the massive impact League of Legends had. So in the EU, first of all, consider the fact that Moscow 5, through their success in League of Legends, became a legit esports organization that then later became Gambit Gaming, and to this day still exists in 2016. Now, when that team was formed, like end of 2011, early 2012, with this lineup that just won a qualifier to go to an IEM, they were no one. They were absolutely nobodies. Like, the League of Legends team I'm talking about right now. In terms of the org, yeah, the org existed. The org was sponsoring a Counter-Strike team, and they were a decent Counter-Strike team. By that point in time, they were challenging for top 3, top 4 at tournaments, but they weren't close to a massive one. They were considered, they just only sponsor that Russian team. There's not that great organization in Russia. Like, this was not considered a premier esports org. But Moscow 5 over 2012 in season 2, because they were the best team for most of the time from the West, and even in the world for the first sort of 8 or 9 months, this made this already a team that had all these opportunities going into the following years of LCS, etc., to become a legit team, to become a legit organization, which has now lasted years and years and years, and had a number of good teams and a number of okay and a number of decent teams. Once the success fell off, sure, they weren't the biggest anymore, but just the success of the League of Legends team really had a big impact on Moscow 5. Obviously, later on, it became Gambit Gaming. It wasn't the same organization, because that guy, whatever, allegedly was like arrested for credit card fraud or some crazy shit like that, as far as I know, some sort of cybercrime. But you could see how the swing of just success in League of Legends could change the fortunes of your organization in a way that many other games, that wouldn't be the case in that scenario. And also, your squad would just get poached away in other games. That's why you wouldn't be able to parlay it to the same degree. Unfortunately, LCS itself shut that down to some degree, because we all know the circumstances of those teams not being able to get visas to come to Europe and get work visas means that because LCS you have to be there for so long, they've always had to skip weeks, which has had an impact on them. They had to travel ridiculously every week when they were the full Russian lineup of Gambit Gaming, and as a result, we saw the degradation of their results. Now, listen, no lineup lasts forever and is amazing forever, so I've no doubt they would have fallen out eventually. But you look at the timeline of it, and it feels like for season 3 they could have been a much higher level team if we were back in the season 2 circuit rather than what happened in season 3. So in a way, League of Legends and then the LCS era of it also took them down. It gave them with one hand and it took with the other one. So that's just unfortunate in that particular sense. You look at the fact that Riot did bring LCS around, though, and this shook up the organizational hierarchy in terms of letting some of what were the minnows in the scene, if you consider it like the analogy of the sharks and the minnows, the massive orgs and the little ones with the little bottom feeders trying to scrap and make it and survive. These little ones, thanks to LCS allowing only one org one team per org. So, for example, Fnatic couldn't just have two teams, and SK couldn't just have two teams, which they probably would have done, by the way, if some of these options were available. I know in North America, especially, those big orgs would have. But since you couldn't, it meant there were more slots because there was 8 LCS spots. So which 8 teams are going to be in there? Well, first of all, not every team in Europe invested in League of Legends or wanted a big team or had a good team or even qualified. Therefore, thanks to the LCS scenario coming along, one of the things that shook up the scene was here was one of the bigger leagues with big viewing figures, and suddenly we had these little minnows not only surviving, but in certain cases thriving. So we had Copenhagen Wolves. They were always a joke, tier 2, at times tier 3 org before League of Legends, but obviously they got into position, they built up better players, better teams, they got more money, and now they're considered like a decent org. I mean, they're not considered a massive one anymore, but they were in LCS for a long time. Before that, they were much lower tier, and they weren't relevant on the big top-level esports scene. H2K is a great example because at the moment they have the best League of Legends team in Europe. And yet this was an organisation which was famous in Swedish Counter-Strike for being one of those orgs that's just like second tier within that scene and always has like decent players who are either going to get stuck at that level or go on to be in an SK or a Fnatic, etc. But never having lineups in general that are going to be world class. Yeah, they had the odd tournament, like they had a DreamHack Summer 2010 where they made it to the final, but that was kind of the bracket and there was a little bit of a fluke involved there and they weren't a world class organisation at the time. MYM's another obvious one. They'd fallen away a long time from before because they'd originally been a team that had massive investment into them and therefore with that money they'd paid huge salaries. But then when the recession happened, when their team had fallen apart and had no sponsorship, they survived on this very low level, but they were able to come back and be relevant again. Obviously later that all became Super Hot Crew in terms of the organisation. But you go back and you look when they were MYM, and this was, it's the other way around, it's Super Hot Crew became MYM. But the fact that MYM had any kind of foothold at any point in time with the Polish team, etc., they again got a chance to be relevant in a way they hadn't been on a larger esports scale. Now, obviously, Riot's stipend for playing in LCS was a big reason for this, because what it meant was if you could get a team to qualify for LCS, your basic costs of doing that and then meant you didn't sort of have any costs, because then they give you all this money, which you just paid to the teams as salary. And in Europe, especially, some people were doing this, just paying the Riot stipend, not much from themselves. And you could have a decent team then. And you could afford to buy a lot of the things and get the team a house and all the rest of it. In this scenario, you had essentially a budget you were working with that you wouldn't get for another game. There's also the fact that by having an LCS spot, if you were like a Copenhagen Wolves type team, even if you weren't necessarily going to have success yourself or build on it much, you could then wait for that spot to get more and more valuable. Because over the years, it became hard to get into LCS. And then once you're in LCS, the spot became worth more and more. And we've seen now you can sell for millions. So now we're in a position where it's completely thrown away the hierarchy of what happened before because of what can happen in terms of being able to sell a spot. Also, the bigger orgs in Europe did not gamble on going all in as much on League of Legends, mainly because of how they've been burned on games like Warcraft 3 in the past and certain scenarios like that. So instead they stuck with the games like StarCraft 2 and like CS that were more like died in the wool esports and they knew more about, and it's like they understood the way this was and the hierarchy and the rough trajectory that had lasted years and years of where these games are going. They didn't gamble as much on League of Legends. Therefore in EU you saw a number of orgs fall away who were great orgs, and actually that's ended up being that as overall orgs they're not as big and they're not as powerful and they're not considered sharks anymore. Some of them are approaching status of minnows now and have been superseded. Now, in North America particularly, that's where it got really interesting. Because in North America, essentially, what were the League of Legends orgs that only came around as orgs to support some of the best North American League of Legends teams who stayed solo instead of going to big European orgs, these have essentially become some of the biggest organizations in Western esports outside of like an Evil Geniuses. Because Evil Geniuses already existed, already was in North America, and already was one of the biggest in the world. But you have to realize, aside from Evil Geniuses, basically all the biggest orgs were in Europe at the time. Now, you can see that they're this big, even beyond the League of Legends aspect, by the fact that when these people have come into games like CSGO recently, they're working with way bigger resources, their entries had way more fanfare, they've been able to snap up teams and players, much more so than they should as people who are brand new orgs coming in into games that they've never worked with before. People like Team Liquid now, obviously they've later on come from StarCraft 2, but we think of them as the old Curse org. Then we had TSM, and we have CLG, and we have Dignitas, etc. Although Dignitas did have some presence in Counter-Strike before, but they'd been not a premier org in the normal esports world. They were in the more side games before League of Legends came along and helped boost them by the success of the League of Legends. Now, obviously, the success of the teams of these orgs helped as well, but you look at a team like SK, an organization. SK was one of the biggest in the world, has always been in history, and was absolutely still very big at the time League of Legends came along, had this success in terms of LCS. Now, an org like this could have made power plays. They could have gotten M5's lineup when M5 went to shit and they became Gambit. They could have gotten the CLG EU lineup rather than let that team go over and become evil geniuses. They could have made the bid for it and said, hey, stay in Europe and be bad and you'll be the main aspect of ours. They could have had all these different chances where they could have gone to, but they didn't because they didn't want to pay more salary. They were worried about the salaries that were being costed at the time because they were really high numbers, especially because some of these people could stream. So they were like, well, if I don't get this much salary, I could make it just from streaming. So they were worried about how high the salary was and thought it was like untenable, like it was inflation, it was a bubble, it wasn't going to be able to grow reasonably. They're worried about the growth of the game. What if I invest all this money now and as a game it dies away in a year or in 2 years, it's not as big a game, or Riot, God forbid, pulls out the support in that scenario? What happens to us then? So they were worried about this and they didn't go all in on it. Now, some of these other people, League of Legends, they're already all in anyway. And they believe in the game and all the rest of it, blah, blah, blah. Now, there's been people who failed in esports from doing that, but that gave them this natural competitive advantage in this sense. An organization like Fnatic, in some ways cheated, as in Fnatic didn't really put like massive amounts of money in it. They didn't go all in this way. They were quite like an SK, just waiting to see. But what you got to understand about Fnatic is, Season 1, they got a lot of success early on. And then, yeah, Season 2 wasn't good, but Season 3 onwards, they had such fantastic success from the teams that buoyed them up, that always made them relevant, that always made them still considered a big org. And then in CS, etc., they always had fantastic success as well. So they've never been the biggest, they've never been the best organization, but the success has always kept them relevant in a sense. Some of the best organizations pre-LCS in esports, like I say, were all in Europe, but they were orgs like SK Gaming, not as big now, had some success in League of Legends the last few years to make them still somewhat relevant, but even then they were nowhere near as relevant as they were before LCS era, when they were like a top 3, top 5 org in the world at some points in time, sometimes the best org in the world if you go back like a decade, and even in that latter period, like top 10 for certain in the whole world, and in terms of the West, like top 2 or 3. They were big. Fnatic was pretty big, mainly because of the Counter-Strike team, but then coming into other games, they'd gotten bigger, and League of Legends helped them grow a little bit. They're obviously still considered a big org, but then you look at some of the other ones. Some of these ones don't exist or have died off massively. MTW died entirely. They had one of the best Counter-Strike teams of all time for a number of years. They were considered a big org, a premier place to play. Mouse Sports, this was a team that was always very big, and they've dropped off to the extent they're considered now largely just a German org, whereas they'd come out of being a German org, become a big international org, and now they've shrunk back again. It's like the whole universe expanding and then contracting back in on itself. So you can see League of Legends on all levels has just shaken up the hierarchy of like games in general, because obviously it's a free-to-play game that then made millions and millions and millions and billions and God knows how much, whereas at the time the model was you made the game and you made all the money up front by selling the game. So it shook up the scene in that particular sense, shook up the scene as an esports game. It broke its way in there, it forced its way in there, they made these investments, then it was able to deliver on it and show the big viewing figures and get a massive scene. But then the LCS era came along, but then the LCS era, as much as it shut down the tournament scene and wasn't as good in that sense, it brought along stipends, it brought along salaries, and some of these aspects that have helped growth there. And then you saw how it shook up the hierarchy of the actual organizations themselves. People like SK fell by the wayside, while people like TSM, that was just a guy and his brother and then making a team, rose up to be even bigger than an SK, a team that had been around for like over 10 years and had all this success, many world championships, all these great relationships with sponsors, Intel, AMD, all these different people, and they could overtake them in the space of a year or two. That's how incredible the almost exponential growth of League of Legends at one point in time was, and how expansive it was to the whole esports industry. And so it's quite an incredible story when you look at it on all these different levels.